Well, thank you. Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here with you tonight in beautiful St. George. As you've heard, the Crossroads exhibit is on display just for a couple more days at the Silver Reef Museum. So if you have not seen it, do get up there and take a look. And if you can't, and you happen to be in other parts of the state in coming months, you can check out the exhibit at its future stops. And Brigham City is up next, and that's a long way away. It's the other end of the state. Green River, and then Ephraim, it will be its closing venue. That will be the 8th of 8. This has been a pretty good tour, not like the water tour we did last, where it just went on and on and on, but it's good. I also encourage you to pick up a copy of our essay, Rural Utah at a Crossroads. I saw a couple of people had them, I think. I don't know if do we have copies back there? There we go. That is an essay that I wrote with two co-authors, Megan Weiss and Nate Housley, to put together a statewide context for this exhibit. And so just a little background on what Museum on Main Street is, how this program works. Museum on Main Street is a three-way partnership between the Smithsonian Institution's Traveling Exhibition Service, State Humanities Councils, and the local venues, in this case, the Silver Reef Museum. And the basic idea behind Museum on Main Street is to bring these national exhibits to small communities across the country. As the state consulting scholar, my job is to take the ideas from this national touring exhibit and bring a state and local twist to them, to make them more, to bring that context into play. Because a lot of it, as you see an exhibit that is put together for a national tour, it is fairly generic in a lot of ways. And it'll focus in on places where we might not be right now. But every place has a unique story. That was our job here, right? So to tell Utah's unique history while not losing sight of the state's connection to larger themes and events. Now, in my talks, when I do these talks, I'm traveling around to all of these venues. I try to focus in on issues of particular relevance to host communities for the exhibit. Speaking to you in St. George has me in a bit of a quandary. The exhibit is on display up at Silver Reef, at Leeds, right, just a few miles north of here. And Leeds and Silver Reef have their own unique history, which combines a rural agrarian beginning with the history of extractive industries in the West. This is actually fairly common. We shouldn't think of extractive industries as anomalies. I'll get to that in a little bit, all right? In Leeds, in Silver Reef, albeit with lots of giant McMansions being built around, it still evinces this kind of rural feeling. St. George, not so much anymore. Try to cross St. George Boulevard on foot like I just did, right? You better be pretty quick. St. George is another matter. Whether you're speeding down the interstate, going to a big box store, or passing all of those new communities being built. I flew into the airport today and took a little Uber in and went past all of those developments being built all the way out to the south and to the east of the city, right? St. George is and feels urban now. And so what I want to do is talk about Washington County's history more broadly this evening. And I want to talk about change, because change is evident everywhere around us here. And I want to talk about why we are often uneasy about change in rural Utah. Now, change it's in the title of the exhibit from the Smithsonian, Crossroads, Change in Rural America. This is a drone shot of Spanish Fork, if you could pick out where this is, right? That's looking towards Spanish Fork Canyon. You can just make out, over here you can make out the windmills at the mouth of Spanish Fork Canyon, US 6 going up towards Soldier Summit. And you can see the change creeping into that agricultural land. You can see that transformation, on the Wasatch Front. Change elicits different emotions from different people. Some see welcome change, right? Others view change with trepidation. Some are ambivalent. In many rural communities, some people may view new economic opportunities as the product of change, while others cast suspicious eyes on potential social and cultural changes. And nowhere in Utah is this more evident, I would argue, than in Washington County. The most obvious measure of that change is, of course, population growth. Today, just 54 years ago, in 1970, 54 years ago in 1970, the entire population of Washington County was what? What do you think? 14,000. 54 years ago. 14,000. There are 100,000 people, more than 100,000 people in the city limits of St. George, and 180,000 in Washington County now, almost all of them concentrated in the metropolitan statistical area. Right? The Kem Gardner Center at the University of Utah predicts that Washington County will be home to over 500,000 people by the middle of this century. Right? That is a profound change. Now, aside from the question of resources, most notably water, which I'm not going to discuss, our last exhibit was on water. I could do a talk on water here, but I'd also have to probably put on some protective gear. You know how water is not a controversial topic at all. But such an influx of people brings cultural, social, and economic change. Besides sheer numbers, we can see that in demographics. Who now lives in St. George? Who is moving to Hurricane, Santa Clara? Why are they moving? Certainly there's folks here who have lived their entire lives. I know some of the people we have sitting right in front of me, they've spent much of their lives here, or all of their lives in Washington County. But many others are relative newcomers, or newcomers at all, right? Many are moving to the area, are coming here for quality of life, right? The rural character of the landscape might be attractive, but they're not coming here to work the land or to extract minerals from the ground, right? Most are urbanites seeking the amenities of life in a spectacular red rock desert. The proximity of Zion and Grand Canyon and all of these national parks and all these other options for public recreation are certainly a draw. And so the story of Washington County today is change. But what I want to argue is that it always has been. That change, the concept here is the change in rural America and in rural Utah has been ongoing. Right? Now, I just want to point out this map, though. This is from the Gardner Center, and this projected change. It doesn't mean more people are going to live in Washington County than along the Wasatch Front. It simply means that that's the fastest growing area. Washington County has been the fastest growing county in the fastest growing state in the nation. Between 2010 census and 2020 census, Utah's population grew by 18%. Yeah, outstripped the closest competitors are Idaho and Nevada, so it's all sort of right in the Intermountain West where you see these population increases. Anyway, now before we dive into the story of change, it's worth defining what we mean by rural and urban. We got a little bit of that. You basically took my shtick right there where I was going to talk about how arbitrary these definitions really are. Now that Utah is urban, and that's what I'm going to point out here, might come as a shock to many Utahns who don't think of themselves as city folk. Utah's full of open spaces, they might say, or they might say that Utah's culture reflects a pioneer spirit. But by most measures, Utah is among the most urban states in an urban nation. Despite all of that open land, the American West, including Utah, is the most urban region. 80% of all Americans live in cities. Over 90% of Utahns live in urban areas. Fully 1/3 of the population of this state lives in Salt Lake County like me. Salt Lake County makes up 1% of the land mass of the state of Utah. 33% of the entire population is in that one county. If you add in the other core counties of the Wasatch Front, Wasatch, Davis, Weber, right, you go to about 80%. If you add in the Wasatch back, you know, Morgan, Summit, and so on, these fast-growing counties, you get the picture, right? It's the vast majority of Utahns live in a very small stretch of land, which you can see, right? So we are an urban state, right? Now, what then does it mean to be rural? Well, you got some of that, right? That rural, according to the Census Bureau, rural is a community of 2,500 people or fewer. It's an arbitrary definition, and as we heard, the state of Utah has a dozen different definitions depending on the agency, right? And these might add up, these might affect how services come to small communities, but they really don't tell us what rural means. I gave a talk in Price last on this tour, and I made this slide, and even though we're not in Price, I think it gets at the arbitrariness of these definitions, right? If we looked at the Census Bureau definitions, Price at 8,000 people is an urban area. But Helper, 5 miles away, that looks exactly like Price in a lot of ways, right, is rural, right? And so when we should not get hung up on these standards. They are arbitrary measures, different statutory definitions. If we looked at those, Silver Reef and Leeds wouldn't be urban if we took another measure from the Census Bureau, and that's, you know, the St. George Metropolitan Statistical Area. Almost all of Washington County's population sits within that definition. Perhaps the only truly rural small community in Washington County that I can think of is Enterprise, right? Sitting out there on the highway going towards Nevada, north of the Pine Creek Mountains. That's an isolated small community, you know. Anyway, but the point of that is that these are arbitrary definitions. And so what is more valuable is ask, what does rural mean to you? Right? Notions of identity and heritage are central to the Crossroads exhibit and to the essay that we have written. In Crossroads, rural is best thought of as small town America. And so tonight we shouldn't get hung up on definitions, but rather think about what rural means to you and what it has meant to you and other Americans and other Utahns. That's what we're going to talk about heritage and identity. Now, if the only constant in change is, the only constant in life is change, why do changes in rural Utah and rural America more broadly cause Americans anxiety? It's easy to understand why families that have worked the land for generations in small communities might look to the future with trepidation when they see such massive change. But why do so many Utahns, who are mostly urbanites, hold such feelings? Why do they, and Americans more generally, place such value on rural life? Why do they lament change? And the simple answer, if somewhat cryptic, is the tagline I came up with for the beginning of that essay, is that Utah is an urban place with a rural heart. Right? This is about identity, it's about culture. So first I want to unpack that notion as well as address, and then move on to addressing the constancy of change in rural Utah. Now, an important reason why Americans feel so deeply about rural America is their ideological connections to rural life that go all the way back to the Revolutionary period, to the founding generation. For many of the founders, most notably Thomas Jefferson, not just him, but most notably Jefferson, an agricultural way of life was the wellspring of democratic values. These values would sustain an American republic. For Jefferson, the very survival of the republic hinged on the existence of an independent, virtuous citizenry that worked the land. Farming was not simply a way to make a living, but a moral occupation that in the end would, as he explained to George Washington in a famous letter, contribute most to real wealth, good morals, and happiness, unquote. Jefferson went even farther in his well-known tract, Notes on the State of Virginia, when he declared, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God," if ever he had a chosen people. Pretty bold statement. This is a frontispiece of a book from that era, Venerate the Plow. I mean, see what the symbolism is in this image, right? Of the farmer plowing the field with Lady Liberty behind him, right? You know, the ideal Revolutionary War soldier. George Washington becomes known as Cincinnatus, right? Cincinnatus is this figure from Roman mythology, or Roman history, who was the citizen soldier, the farmer soldier, right? He laid down his plow, picked up his sword, defended the Roman Republic, and then when the war was over, laid his sword back down, went back to his farming, right? That's the kind of virtue that the founders are at least looking at here. Now, why would Jefferson say that farmers are the chosen people of God? Well, on one level, as I just pointed out, he's restating long-held beliefs in Western European thought. Agriculture was a necessary occupation that benefited society, not just the farmer. As industry developed, built upon that agricultural base, he and others assumed that societies inevitably became more complex and more corrupt. Class divisions increased, virtue faded. But Jefferson saw a way out of this for the new United States, a way to avoid this inevitable decline. Jefferson believed that a relatively new form of economic organization, capitalism, held the key. But his vision was a very different form of capitalism than we think of today, right? His vision was of a utopian agrarian capitalism that would counter the development of class divisions in American life. It would keep everybody in the middle rather than seeing disparities in wealth. He linked economic independence with political independence. He envisioned a United States that developed through space rather than through time. What do I mean by that? I mean, he envisions a nation that expands physically to the west. More and more land is taken, right? That land, which he calls free land of an empire of liberty, of course, it belongs to native people, but we won't talk about that right now either. Again, a whole lecture we could do right there. But as the nation moves west, right, it does not age, right? Jefferson's articulation, I'll get back to this in a minute, right? So a rural agrarian life rather than industrial development offered the surest path, he thought, to avoid corruption and sustain the democratic republic. These farmers would be the backbone of democracy, right? And Jefferson's yeoman ideal, one in which the individual owned and worked his own land with his own family and sold the fruits of their labor in an open market, served as the framework for land policy and for a narrowly defined American identity through the 19th century. It's not an exaggeration to say that in many ways, the utopian vision of capitalism I'm describing here, cherished by so many Americans, originated in these notions of American agrarian democracy. Farming is more than a way to make a living, basically, right? Now, cities and industry are antithetical to that vision. Cities were where the great masses collected. Jefferson called this inevitable decline a decline into European conditions, right? He loved fine wine and he liked all the books from Europe, but he did not want the United States to be Europe. He saw Europe as old and jaded and corrupt. Cities were where great masses collected. Cities were where industrial development led to great gulfs between the wealthy and the powerful and the poor and powerless. For Jefferson, the great promise was that the United States had not yet developed into an industrial society. In his most famous and scathing indictment of industry, Jefferson wrote, and this is also from Notes on the State of Virginia, and bear with me, it's a little bit long, but I'll edit it down as I read this. He wrote, "Corruption of morals is the mark set on those who, not looking up to heaven, to their own soil and industry, as does the husbandman," which is was a 18th century word for farmer, for their subsistence depend for it on the casualties and caprice of customers. Dependence begets subservience and venality, suffocates the germ of virtue, and prepares fit tools for the designs of ambition. He admits that this is, quote, the natural progress and consequence of the arts. Right? But he says, but generally speaking, the proportion of in any, I'm paraphrasing in a shortness, the proportion of farmers to the other segments of society is the proportion of its unsound to its healthy parts. He goes on to say, while we have the land to labor then, let our workshops remain in Europe. The mobs of great cities add just so much to the support of pure government as sores do to the strength of the human body. So this is not welcoming industry. Right? He's saying, no, what we want to do is remain a rural agrarian nation, not to develop in these ways. Yep. Now, this is not merely theoretical. This is not just some rich guy who owns 200 human beings who actually Jefferson calls himself a farmer, but he doesn't do any of the farming, right? It's the 200 enslaved persons that he owns that are doing the farming. But this is not just theoretical. This actually plays itself out physically in the United States, right? It served as a framework for land policy into the 20th century. In pursuit of this vision, the nation adopted policies that would transform public lands into private property. Dividing these lands for distribution was the first step, and the United States instituted the rectilinear survey, which we still use today, right? You probably can recognize this: townships, ranges, sections, quarter sections, right? Other laws provided ways for Americans to purchase or claim individual parcels of the public domain and create their own homesteads. And together these laws, the most famous of which is the Homestead Act of 1862, right? They defined economic democracy and opportunity for generations of Americans. And it is important to remember that Jefferson's ideals were meant to be revolutionary. They embodied a new start. He believed the nation embodied a new start, and a nation that could reinvent itself free of the hierarchies and inequalities of Europe, right? Where this kind of system would not be possible, where the land was controlled by feudal lords and an aristocracy or wealthy individuals, right? Now, the reality often falls short of the ideal. The laws intended to ensure equitable distribution of land to bona fide settlers often faltered, allowing some to make great fortunes through land speculation. George Washington and Henry Knox were two who made quite a bit of money off of land speculation in this period. Moreover, the promise was not open obviously to all Americans, including the enslaved persons that worked in Jefferson's fields. Now, when the first LDS colonists came to what was then Mexican territory, the idea of seeking freedom and prosperity in the West had already become central to American ideals. And while they shared many of those beliefs and beliefs with other 19th century Euro-Americans, they also attached their own layers of social and religious meanings to rural life. And in this way, they shaped a distinct Utah rural identity that is on top of that national rural identity. For early Mormon pioneers, an agrarian life was both a necessity. The first contingent into the Salt Lake Valley planted potatoes the very day they arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. The first thing they did was dam City Creek and plant potatoes. Brigham Young wasn't even there yet. He shows up the next day. This is the 23rd, by the way. We always celebrate the 24th as Pioneer Day in Utah. The first group was actually in the valley, the 23rd, right? Anyway, that's just an aside. So, I mean, this is something they needed they needed simply to survive in this place. There was little distinction for early Mormons between religious, economic, and political understandings of land. Their identity drew from religious ideals such as biblical prophecy, that they would make the, quote, desert would blossom as the rose, as well as the practical necessity as cooperating as a community. Now, the Mormon pioneer identity is fundamentally about overcoming the hardships of an unforgiving land. And the life of a homesteader anywhere involved plenty of difficult work, but the perils of crossing a continent and irrigating an unfamiliar environment posed additional challenges that became the source of pride for rural communities across Utah. But there are also major differences with that Jeffersonian ideal I do want to point out. While the Jeffersonian ideal emphasized private ownership, right, private property ownership, early Mormon society set aside absolute property rights in favor of communitarianism. Right? Communitarianism privileges shared values and collective responsibility over the rights and prerogatives of the individual. In the first decades of Mormon settlement, the church owned common resources, redistributed the products of the community, and assigned labor. As Brigham Young decreed, quote, "There shall be no private ownership of the streams that come out of the canyons, nor the timber that grow in the hills. These belong to the people, all the people," unquote. And as some of you might know, in the early years of Mormon settlement in Utah, church leaders distributed land by casting lots. Land was distributed through and according to status or perceived need. Right? Farmers worked individual plots, but those plots were watered by collective irrigation works and enclosed by a single fence. It was not until 1869, when the United States land laws were finally extended to Utah, that true private ownership of land became possible even. Right? And that's also the same year that the railroad comes. If you read the essay, that the Transcontinental Railroad and the changes that come with that are very important in Utah history. Now, while Mormon collectivism grew from a religious desire for a unified community, the realities of Western agriculture reinforced that pattern. As I talked a lot about in the water essay, Utah simply does not get enough rainfall. At least not rainfall at the right time of the year, the growing season. And that meant irrigation. And even in later decades, agriculture in Utah and the West still demanded some measure of cooperation as farmers depended on the same limited water sources. So thus, for both religious and practical reasons, Utah's settlement patterns and cultural landscape diverged from the Jeffersonian model of isolated homesteads. For a communitarian society to thrive, the people had to live in a community. And one of the things, I don't have a slide in here, but one of the things you might think about here is what cultural geographers call the Mormon cultural landscape. Has anyone ever heard that phrase? So if you want to see it on display, one of the best places to see it's the Sanpete Valley. A place like Spring City, right? Small communities, compact settlement together, farms and fields that surround that compact settlement, irrigation ditches, Lombardy poplar trees as windbreaks, unpainted fences and barns, not the houses, but the barns and fences. All of these things are indicative of a cultural landscape. And cultural landscapes reflect both the physical place, but also the culture and the values of the people who are doing this. And in Utah, most of it has been erased. Right? Utah Valley used to look a lot like that. There used to be a lot of orchards, and now it's the Silicon Slopes. So we see a lot of that change. So if you get a chance to get up there, go to Spring City. I think every house is on the National or the Utah State Historic Register. Almost every house has a plaque on the door. It's become a very artist-centric place. We talk about it some in the essay as well. All right, I'm getting behind here. I'm sort of doing too many asides, so I'll try to stay on track. Some of you might recognize this place not too far from here. Now, if agriculture was the basis of Mormon society, Brigham Young understood that homegrown industry was essential for Mormon self-sufficiency and autonomy. He also dispatched surveys to locate resources, either to support Mormon development or to trade as commodities. For example, the discovery of iron ore deposits led to the Iron Mission and to southern Utah in late 1850, and that's where towns like Parowan and Cedar City would come from and give Iron County its name. Now, in addition to a string of strategic colonies that would provide much-needed commodities and raw materials, coal, iron, flax, cotton, Brigham Young also moved to establish missions to native peoples, both as a religious imperative, but also as a way to create alliances at a time when there was a great deal of tense suspicion and relations between the church and Utah and the federal government. And that's how Washington County's origins relate to both of those strategic concerns. Permanent Mormon settlement began, as most of you probably in the room know, out of Fort Clara, not too far west of here, on the Santa Clara River, just to the west. It was part of a mission to local Paiutes. And in addition to their missionary duties, the colonists also experimented with planting cotton and other warm weather crops, such as grapes. These are crops that might potentially decrease Mormon reliance on outside trade. Right? The results were less than promising. As you know, water is scarce here. Cotton is a very thirsty crop. Alkaline soils, blistering summer heat made matters worse. Yet, with the outbreak of the Civil War and a spike in cotton prices, Young called 300 more families to go south as part of the cotton mission. And that's the reason why, of course, we're sitting here at a university that used to be called Dixie, right? And Utah's Dixie, that whole name comes from that idea of the cotton mission. Even more families followed, and eventually more than 3,000 Mormon settlers moved into the deserts of southwest Utah. Southwest Utah and southeastern Nevada in the early 1860s. St. George was established in 1861, and by the middle of the 1860s, communities had scattered along the course of the Virgin River from the gates of modern-day Zion National Park in Springdale to St. Thomas in Nevada, which would later be submerged under the rising waters of Lake Mead, although it's popping back up now as Lake Mead has fallen. The Virgin River for these folks was both a savior and a curse in times of drought and in times of flood. And for the extreme aridity. St. George sees less than 9 inches of precipitation in a year, which means you're not growing crops with just the rain that falls. There's not a chance. But sometimes a lot of water falls. These settlers came from very different experiences. I want to emphasize that. I want to emphasize the change part of it. If you put yourself in this position, right, they came from very different experiences and environments, either in the humid East or an equally green Europe. They moved into a landscape like they had never experienced before. And so they were experiencing radical change in their own lifetimes. For them, the rural existence they lived, right, was not one of stability and surety, but it was one of great change, of challenge, and sometimes it broke the people, who tried to live here. The story of the big washout of 1862, which I wrote about in the water essay, I think helps illustrate some of how those early colonists experienced change. Now, in late 1861, Fort Clara was a thriving community just to the west of here. It was laid out around a stone fort. There were orchards and fields. There were a recent influx of new migrants. And to see who knows their Washington County history, where'd they come from? Switzerland. Can you imagine that? You ever seen a picture of Switzerland? Does not look like St. George, does not look like Red Rock Desert, right? So these people coming from a very wet place with a lot of water, a lot of snow, right? And so they arrive at the end of 1861. These Swiss-born Mormon converts. And so to make room for them, the mission surveyed homestead lots about a half-mile downstream of the fort, closer to where St. George is. And the new arrivals immediately set about damming the Santa Clara, building ditches, and doing all this work. And on Christmas Day, it began to rain, 1861. And they have no way to know it, but it's going to rain for 2 months. This is, if you look at this, this is causes the most devastating floods in the history of California. California, Nevada, Oregon, whole communities get washed away. It's part of this incredibly wet weather system that comes through at the end of 1861, January of 1862. On January 17th, 1862, the flood came down the Santa Clara River and hits Fort Clara. It was likened, quote, to the sea as it came out of the canyon and spread over the bottoms from hill to hill, unquote. The water drowned livestock, it tore out huge cottonwood trees, destroyed the grist mill. The next day, the water went down that evening, but the next day it came back and it undercut the fort. And it led to this mad dash scramble that everybody had to get out of the fort, wading through water. In a few hours, the fort was completely gone. Jacob Hamlin wrote, "There was not a single rock of the old fort to be seen, but a channel where it once stood. The schoolhouse and 7 other houses above the fort had also disappeared, and in their place now roared the wild torrents of the river." That's pretty radical change, right? Dealing with, obviously this is not an average flood, but they're common enough here. And adapting to this area and to this environment was a radically different experience. And, you know, imagine yourself coming again from Switzerland to Santa Clara, to Fort Clara, Utah. Right? The experience was not of stability and tradition, but of radical change. And Washington County provides many other examples of change in rural Utah. If we consider the experience of those in Leeds and Harrisburg and Silver Reef, we see another pattern of change that characterizes the story of rural Utah. Right? And here's where we get to these ideas, right? The sense of what is rural. When you think of rural, what images come to mind? Do you think of picturesque haystacks and barns, or do you think of a silver mine? Do you think of a quiet country lane with split rail fences and sunflowers, or do you think of a stamp mill? Right? In Utah and in the nation as a whole, it is those agrarian images on this side that people have revered. And it comes to mind when people talk about bucolic or rural, right? But in fact, both of those are true. Both of those are true in the history of Utah, and they're true in the history of the American West. Commercial mining seemingly brought, I jumped ahead too far here. And this is a central point we wanted to make in rural Utah at the Crossroads, that mining and other industries have sustained and continue to sustain, or they were a part of the history of many small communities, even if they don't hold the same beloved place in Utah's rural heart. Now, commercial mining, Mormon leaders held deeply ambivalent views of mining. As I said before, leaders like Brigham Young, they understood they needed the raw materials, but they were wary of outsiders, either in the form of external investment or migrant workers. In their view, outsiders were a threat to their identity, forged as it was out of this ideal of community. Commercial mining seemingly brought the very things that Jefferson had worried about, particularly as the industry developed over the course of the 19th century. Mining was an expensive endeavor dominated by corporations and inextricably tied to external financing and markets and prone to boom-bust economies. People who know Silver Reef's history, they know boom-bust is the story of places like Silver Reef. The ghost towns that dot rural Utah are testimony to this fact. Now, for this reason, Brigham Young specifically discouraged the first LDS settlers from prospecting for precious metals. He feared that a gold or silver rush would drain precious labor from agriculture and attract non-Mormons to the territory. Remember, he wants to keep non-Mormons out. He wants to keep Mormon control over Utah. So he doesn't want to make it attractive to outsiders to come in. And this was a principal reason that guy, Patrick Edward Connor, the officer responsible for the Bear River Massacre, and one of Young's great political foes, virulently anti-Mormon, Connor, He leads the California Volunteers to and establishes Fort Douglas, is where the American West Center is located on the university. It's today the University of Utah campus, but it was a military Fort Douglas in 1862. He wants to break Mormon power. He wants to break Mormon control. Connor is also known as the father of Utah mining. He is buried in the Fort Douglas Cemetery. And if you go there, this big rock that is his tombstone, one of the things it says on it is father of Utah mining. Right? Why does it say that? Well, he sent some of his soldiers out immediately to prospect. He was an Irish immigrant who joined the United States Army, fought in the Mexican War, ended up in California during the gold rush, became a well-off merchant in Stockton, California. When the Civil War broke out, he became a colonel of volunteer troops. Right? He had seen the gold rush. He saw what the gold rush did to California native people. And he thought, what's the best way to destroy Mormon control in Utah? Find gold, find silver. And then tens of thousands of people would flood, non-Mormons would flood into Utah. Right? And so you get, this is what Connor wanted to do. Now, despite their wariness, commercial mining in Utah took off in the 1860s. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad at the end of the decade brought much greater interest and investment. And despite the best efforts of church leaders, the outside world could not be held back. And that's where we come into the story of a place like, I think, Silver Reef really illustrates that history. Now, before there was Silver Reef, of course, there was Harrisburg. In the spring of 1861, after a previous failure downstream, Moses Harris and his family founded Harrisburg. The waters of Quail Creek made agricultural settlement possible, but not easy. And by 1864, Harrisburg had a population of 128. Wheat, cotton, but especially corn were the principal crops. But still, the settlement struggled. And then, of course, I mean, we have the former mayor of Leeds here knows that Leeds was founded shortly thereafter when some folks thought, well, this is going to be the better place, better land to farm, easier to get water onto the land. And so Leeds will be founded. Now that story changes, of course, in Montana. And like with many gold rushes, people fan out from there and they start looking for other leads and other places, right? And that's what Kemple was doing, right? So he journeyed south from Montana. As he roomed with Orson Adams in Harrisburg for the winter, he began prospecting, and he soon discovered silver in the nearby reef of Navajo sandstone. Right? But the boom did not happen immediately. And because silver is not generally found, sandstone is a sedimentary rock, right? And that's not usually where you find precious metals. And you can ask a geologist to explain fully how this actually happened. Not common, though. So many were incredulous. Kemple himself gave up twice on the mining district, finally selling off his claims for good in 1874. And it's the following year, and this is where that outside investment comes from, right? Dependence on outsiders, that the Walker brothers, wealthy bankers in Salt Lake City, financed an agent, William Barbie, who made new discoveries, state claims, and founded Bonanza City. Later, other miners would found Rockpile, which became Silver Reef. Right? The Walker brothers, if you ever go to Salt Lake, well, if you go to downtown Salt Lake City today, you'll be stunned by how many 30-story buildings there are. But there's also the Walker Center is still there on the corner of 200 South and Main Street. And you look at it, it has a little tower, the light on top says Walker on the side of it, right? It's hard to believe that that was for decades the tallest building in Utah and the tallest building between Denver and San Francisco. Hard to believe that if you see that today. Now, in any case, the boom bust in this case is going to benefit Silver Reef at first, right? Because the bust occurs in Pioche, Nevada. And many of those miners flock over, right? And that's, I joke to my classes and to other folks that I like driving across the West Desert and out into Nevada and across to some of these places. And invariably, every ghost town you drive to in the state of Nevada, there's going to be a historic plaque that says, between this date and this date, this was the largest or the second largest city in the state of Nevada. Right? And now everywhere you go, they're like that. Right? So that's the story of mining in the West, in P-Ocean, and eventually in Silver Reef. Miners set up a new town just north of Bonanza City, as I said, and it became Silver Reef. 2,000 people lived there by 1879. Most were non-Mormon, as most miners were. Dozens of mines and 5 stamp mills to process the ores were built. Silver Reef's Main Street boasted hotels, saloons, banks. The scene was typical of many boom towns across the West. And typical, too, was labor unrest. Now, because again, most of those miners are not, mining is an expensive endeavor. And by the time you start going underground mining, it's not that individual prospector with a pan, right? It's capital intensive, it's investment intensive. So these are wage laborers essentially. And when the price of silver falls in a global market, people's wages are cut. This leads to labor unrest. And these are the kind of things, again, that Jefferson was worried about, right? The masses and so on. Now the boom lasts pretty much, really less than a decade. In 1879, fire destroyed much of the town and wage cuts led to strikes. 2 years later, like I said, the price of silver was volatile in the global market, impacting the profitability of mining companies. And by the mid-1880s, the boom had become a bust. And although silver production trickled on for 10 or 15 more years, Silver Reef increasingly became a ghost town. And despite several attempts to reopen the mines in the 20th century that were unsuccessful, and there was a brief foray into uranium mining in post-World War II, in the post-World War II era, which is also very common of Utah, but more so in San Juan County and in the Colorado Plateau. There's a lot more uranium ore over there. The mine never came back. The mining never came back. So we see that boom bust, right, as part of the story of the rural West. Now, what I haven't addressed here is the relationship between Silver Reef and its neighboring towns, Leeds and Harrisburg. While one might assume that with a hostile relationship would prevail between non-Mormon, many Catholic miners and small Mormon communities, considering all these social, cultural, and religious differences. In fact, the relations remained mostly amicable. Farmers found a market in their produce among the miners, and miners brought much-needed influx of cash into the local economy. Remember that most rural agrarian economies in Utah in the 19th century, these are pretty close to the bone. These are barter and trade societies as well. There's not a whole lot of cash in circulation. And that's why the church had tithing ranches, you know, Pipe Spring. Right? Pipe Spring was a tithing ranch for the church because people didn't have money to pay their tithing to the church. What would they do? They'd give the church cattle. Right? And that's why those tithing ranches in the Cache Valley, on Antelope Island, in Great Salt Lake, at Pipe Spring, and in other places were established. And this is a typical relationship. As I said, I recently gave a talk in Price, and a very similar dynamic between local farmers and coal miners there played out. Right? That the mines become a principal market for what farmers might produce. And so the point being, though, that rural Utah has never just been about agriculture, nor just about extractive industry, but it's also been a place where change has been constant. And I've run way over, so I'm going to, in closing, let me just return to that point, that Utah has never been locked into a pristine, unchanging past. We can look back fondly at aspects of rural Utah's history, but we shouldn't engage in uncritical nostalgia. For Mormon settlers in what became Utah, the agrarian ideal promised autonomy, but it also posed great challenges. In truth, the ideal of a self-sufficient, separate identity apart from the larger United States was never fully attainable. Agriculture and extractive industry often went hand in hand, or in many communities, extractive industry became the lifeblood of those communities. And so as we see great change today, the history of rural Utah is a story of change. And Washington County illustrates that that change continues today. Contemporary pressures that drive change may seem daunting, yet adaptation has always been core to rural life. And the question is how to come together and manage change in order to build and sustain communities. And if I've complicated your view of Utah, that was my hope. I also hope that my talk and our essay, which I hope there's a few copies back there if you don't have a copy, will encourage you to engage more fully with the Crossroads exhibit and consider what the past might teach us about the challenges that lie ahead. And I encourage you all to get up to Silver Reef Museum in the next couple of days to see the exhibit before it moves on to the other end of the state, because it's a long drive to Brigham City from here. All right, thank you all for listening tonight. And I'm happy to take questions.
So you were talking about settlements along the Virgin River.
Mm-hmm.
When one was emerging from Lake Mead, what settlement was that?
Oh, that is, what is it? St. Thomas. St. Thomas. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, all the way down the Virgin River there were settlements. In the water essay, I wish I had the quote. Juanita Brooks has one of the most powerful quotes about the Mormon settlements along the river. And she's saying that basically that her people have been at war with that river since the very beginning. And it's a war that neither side could ever win. That they had no chance of ever taming that river, but then the river couldn't shake them from its banks. And it's really a touching, it's power, and Juanita Brooks could write much better than I just paraphrased. But really, I mean, that was part of it. When you think of life in a place like this, where if you're trying to build an agrarian center, you have to irrigate. And to irrigate here with shifting sands meant rebuilding dams on a yearly basis. When you get floods, you know, we have short, steep watersheds around here, but they drain a large area of uplands. And so when the Virgin River floods, it floods, right? And that can be just devastating. And so that's just a really tough place to make a living. And that's why, you know, when you think about that statistic of 1970, 14,000 people lived in Washington County. That's it, right? That's at a time when people were still, I mean, the focus of the economy was pretty much that, was ranching and agriculture, right? It's that shift that occurs. You know, you've got 3 decades in a row, I think, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, when the population of Washington County increased 90% each decade. You know, and those people are not coming to build dams. And they're going to benefit from dams, big dams built in other places, right? But they're coming to live in this place. And you see the diversification of the economy. So you see radical change. That wasn't, all you wanted to know is St. Thomas, and I rambled on. I'm prone to do that.
No, that's good.
Other questions? Yes.
Yes, I have a question. Did Thomas Jefferson ever mention all these slaves that, I mean, it seems kind of hypocritical.
It is.
You know,
It's wildly hypocritical. It's one of those the problem with Jefferson, you know, and a lot of people, you know, want him to have acknowledged that. But Jefferson never freed his slaves. He never manumitted his slaves. He talked about the end of slavery, but he talked about it as an inevitability, that eventually it's going to go away. He said it's like, you know, you heard the phrase, a tiger by the tail. He used an older phrase, a wolf by the ears. So it's like we've got this thing, if we let go of it, it's going to turn around and bite us. And so we just kind of, well, we're going to wait it out. It's going to end, it's going to end, it's going to end. But, you know, as other historians have pointed out, he could have not bought all that wine and all those books from Europe. He could have also freed us. He didn't do that. You know, he wrote, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. There are great...
Women aren't created equal.
They were not either. You're right. There's a lot of inequity. This is, you know, this is where you say what is, you know, what is the reality and what is the promise. We are approaching the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and there's going to be a lot of talk about that. You know, about where is American society going? And you know, a lot of that, the rhetoric of the revolution is promise. It's not reality, and it still is, you know, today for some people. And yeah, Jefferson is a problematic figure in American history, but he's critically important. You know, just because people, you know, there are things about them that are horrible, and we abhor these things. Today, we can't ignore the impact of Jefferson's ideas on the United States and on these ideals. Americans have a, you know, I'm going to maybe get myself in trouble here. We have a weird idea about capitalism. As capitalism has functioned in the world, it has led to gulfs between the rich and the poor, right? Jefferson thought it was going to keep everybody in the middle. His great political foe, Alexander Hamilton, said it's going to split everybody apart, and that's okay. Why? Because the rich, the well-born, and the wise, the wealthy would be tied to the survival of federal government. That's what, and I'm going on another way off course here. But what I see is, you know, after Hamilton, the musical came out, all these people are like, oh, Hamilton, you know, everybody loved Hamilton always, and Hamilton was the good guy, and Jefferson was the bad guy. It's like, yeah, it's a lot more complicated than that. Actually, most Americans, I'm not saying Jefferson was a good guy. He owned all those people, right? He enslaved all those people. But most Americans feel more attached to his vision of capitalism than the way it really worked out. And for Hamilton, that really didn't matter, right? He wanted the United States to be a wealthy, powerful nation. And class divisions meant that. And he was okay with that, right? And so I just find it odd because I've had a number of students who, the script has flipped. Lin-Manuel Miranda flipped the script, right? And not that it's not a bad thing. We always want to think about history in different ways and consider different viewpoints. But it was amazing that people, it's just like, oh, Jefferson's a bad guy. Well, yeah, in some ways. But, you know, Hamilton also, if you read what he wrote, you probably would not feel very comfortable with it either, right? Anyway.
Can you give us another paragraph on your future vision of Washington County and Utah?
Oh. I think, you know, accepting limits on growth. I don't know how to do that, though. That's the problem, right? We live in a country where, you know, rightfully people can move to where they want to live. That's been a freedom for Americans. Right now, in you know, the early 21st century and the last several decades of the 20th century, technology allowed people to live in places like St. George that never would have lived here before. Right? You think of the gated communities. Air conditioning and massive water projects allow people to play. I play golf. I got on the plane in Salt Lake City today to fly down here. Got on the plane at 9:30 in the morning. The entire first class section were middle-aged dudes wearing Titleist, Callaway, and Ping hats. Right? We know what they were doing. Right? We know what they were coming here for. That 1970, no. But that also means that you start to see, you know, more and more people, and we also get a loop, an echo chamber of more people means we need more development, but we need more development to supply the needs of people today, but we provide that development. And I swore to people, two things I swore. First of all, this is called the Boeing Auditorium. I swore to people I would not make a joke where those doors actually secure. But secondly, I wouldn't talk about the Lake Powell pipeline. But you know, the idea of massive water projects to serve the needs of people today is one thing, but it's also going to facilitate greater growth, greater demand. So living within our means, accepting limitations might be what we all need to do, but it's also culturally very difficult to do. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer at all. See, I always tell people historians are not prophets. We do not predict the future. We can only talk about the past. So, all right.